Okay, we're in John chapter 15 here this evening. We're going to be looking at verses 9 through 15. This morning we were in verses 1, 2, and 3, and the theme, the imagery that Jesus starts there in verses 1, 2, and 3 continues as he says in verse 4, abide in me. It's that famous verse where he is helping us understand where the power comes from. It's not by being connected to my own effort. It is being connected to the vine. It's abiding, that fellowship. If you were to look at the word abide, throughout its usage in the New Testament, you will find that it's often translated fellowship. Because so as not to complicate the matter, what abiding looks like is an intimate walk with Christ where I'm seeking Him, I'm communicating with Him what He is and what I need. I go to Him regularly. Lord, I'm weak and You're strong in this area. Lord, I'm fearful and You're not fearful. Lord, I need You in this moment. It's a constant fellowship, a constant communicating. That is what, in simplicity, what abiding is. And so in verses 4 and 5, Jesus is explaining that truth using the illustration of the tree. In verse 6, He describes the tragedy of not abiding, and that is you're a branch that's withered and cut off. And then verses 7 and 8, he again describes when a person is abiding in me. Oh, they are my disciple. They produce fruit, but fruit is not your own effort. It's a natural outflow of the abiding life. You can pray for whatever you would will because it's the Spirit, it's the words of Jesus being prayed through you. And then when we come to verse 9, and this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time tonight, verses 9 through 15, Jesus here is going to pick up with a theme that was started all the way back in chapter 14 on the topic of commandments. Tonight I'm going to preach a message entitled Loving God's Commandments. Now when you and I hear that title or the topic of the message that it's going to be about commandments, does that create inside of your soul a warm, fuzzy feeling? If you're anything like me, it doesn't. Because to us, commandments are something to run from. If you ever went to a Christian school, maybe whether it be a high school or college, and maybe the dean or the administrator said, okay, at the beginning of the semester, we're going to pull out the student handbook and let's go through the student handbook. No one gets up and cheers. They don't vote for the administrator to get a raise because of that, because our nature does not like commandments. That's why they're being torn down all over the country, because our nation doesn't like the commandments. And tonight my desire is to not browbeat us on, well, you should love commandments more, though certainly that would be true. I want us tonight to see Christ's view, His theology of commandments. Because when you begin to see how Christ views commandments, it would shape our view and help us to love the commandments of God. Here is my thesis statement tonight. The commandments of God are an invitation to closeness. It is God giving me an invitation to be near to Him. When He issues a commandment, He's not giving us something to restrict our lifestyle. In fact, what He is giving us is an opportunity, an invitation to be near Him. You say, Brother Reed, I'm not sure if I believe that. Well, we're going to look at that here in the Scriptures. Start with me in verse 9 as Jesus starts His argument about the blessedness of commandments. He starts in an unusual place. Verse 9, He says, as the Father hath loved me, so have I loved you. Continue, abide ye in my love. If ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love. These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Ye are my friends, if you do whatsoever I command you. Henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knoweth not what his Lord doeth, but I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father I have made known unto you. He uses, in those few verses there, he uses the word command or commandments 4 different times. Clearly, he's driving towards a point. He's trying to communicate something about commandments. It's part of the theme of what he's dealing with here. And like I mentioned, in chapter 14, he tells his disciples, if ye love me, keep my commandments. But when Jesus preaches about commandments, he does not preach about commandments like it's a list of do's and don'ts, though sometimes that is. What Jesus is preaching when he explains what commandments are, how to obey them, why to obey them, he starts from the premise of love. If you were to count in this passage in verses 9 through 15, so in those 6 verses, if you were to count how many times you see the word commandment, you see it 4 times. If you were to count how many times you see the word love, you'd find it's used 8 times. You'd find that joy is used twice, friend is used 3 times, because what Jesus is trying to communicate is intricately connected to commandments, is love, joy, and friendship. Now, is that how you think of commandments? Is it how my natural man thinks of commandments? I don't. I think run, flee, get away. But that's not what Jesus says. So he says in verse 9, starting this argument, he says, as the Father hath loved me. So you have to understand verse 9 in order to get a hold of verse 10. As the Father hath loved me, so have I loved you. So continue in my love. Experience my love. Abide in my love. So this is what he is saying. He says, to the same level that the Father loves me, you are loved. Now, we're so familiar with verse 9 that doesn't necessarily impact us immediately. Maybe for a new believer that would amaze you, but for those of us who have been in the church for a long time, we think, well, of course, the Father loves the Son. That's just natural. If I was to ask you to go throughout history, all of humanity, and find the greatest demonstration, the greatest illustration of love, of a father loving a child, who would you name? Would you name George Washington? Would you name Benjamin Franklin? Probably not Ben Franklin. Would you think of a human person, or would you go to this illustration? Because the greatest illustration of a father loving a son is this demonstration right here. The Heavenly Father to His Son. Now, sometimes we find ourselves thinking, yeah, but He's God and Jesus was God. That's easy. Anybody would love Jesus. Like, that's not that great of an illustration. But may I ask you this? Why did the Father love Jesus? Did the Father love Jesus because Jesus was perfect? What do you think? Do you think the Father loved Jesus because Jesus was perfect? Like, if Jesus hadn't been perfect, He wouldn't have been loved. Was Jesus perfect? Absolutely. Did the Father love Jesus because Jesus went to the cross? Okay, certainly Jesus went to the cross, but that's not why He loved Him. Did the Father love Jesus because Jesus had never messed up? Did the Father love Jesus because Jesus always prayed? Did the Father love Jesus because Jesus did always the right things? No, that's not why. Even though Jesus never messed up, Jesus prayed, Jesus did the right things. The reason the Father loved Jesus, don't miss this, is because He was His Son. And this is what Jesus is trying to help us see. I am the Son of God. I am His Son, and He loves me because I'm His Son. And because you, if you are a born-again believer, as we said this morning, you're embedded, according to Romans 6, you're embedded into Christ, and you now have the same relationship as Christ to the Father. You are now an adopted child. This is what Jesus is saying. To the same level that I am loved because I am His Son, you are also loved. Why? Because you're perfect? Nope. Because you are His child. Church family, we need to take some time to let that soak in. See, we oftentimes, because our flesh is this way, we are so prone to accepting God's love based upon our performance. And that's the way many human relationships are built. You think of the football team. Man, the coach is really happy with the guys when they're making the catches and when they're running well and making their blocks. And as soon as they play a lousy game, he's all over their case, because in our natural relationships, we're used to perform, I love you, don't perform, and I don't love you. But the breakdown of that illustration, that's a coach to his team, not a father to a son. See, it all changes when there's a family relationship. Do you know how much the Father loved the Son? He demonstrated it several times when He spoke audibly so that human ears could hear. And this is what He said about His Son and to His Son. He said, so all man could hear, this right here is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. He's helping us see, because you're mine, you please me. Church family, if you are a born-again believer, that's what God is saying of you. If you're my child, you please me. He's looking at Brother Bo and saying, Bo, you please me. Caleb, he says, you please me. Brother Cripps, of course, he'd call you David, but I won't call you that. He says, you please me. Are you David Jr.? David Jr., he says, you please me. Ty, you please me. Don, he says, Jesus says, you please me. And we say, but you don't know what I did last night. And the Lord says, I do.
Amen.
But you're mine. And that's why I love you. Do you see what Jesus is saying? To the same level I am loved, you are loved. Church family, we got to get a hold of it. If you are His son, you are unconditionally, unequivocally loved of the Father.
Amen.
When I was a boy, my dad would often say to me, Caleb, man, I love you. And I think, yeah, but you spank me. Like that doesn't seem like so much love. And he would say to me, no, Caleb. He said, you will never understand, until you have your own child, you'll never understand how much I love you. And as a kid, it was kind of like, well, I don't have a kid, so it's hard to understand that. But there came a day, finally, when the Lord allowed my wife and I to have our first child. And I'm telling you, my entire view of a father to a son's relationship completely changed. The reality is, most of us, our view of who God is shaped by our earthly parents. And no parent is perfect, and so therefore we have an imperfect view of who God is. But in my experience, one of the most purest forms of understanding a father's love for a child is in the birthing chamber, in the labor room, whatever you call it. Delivery room, that's the word I'm looking for. Delivery room, birthing chamber. Is that a word? I don't even... Phrase? Maybe it's a new one. When we were getting ready to have my wife and I, after we were married, we found out that we were expecting, and immediately I was scared, nervous, fearful. I mean, about all the normal things like trying to raise a child in this day and age. Those things I was certainly nervous about, but my greatest fear was the labor. I'm one of 8 children, and 5 of us were home births, and my dad was a dairy farmer. But with all of that, I never have seen birth, except for, I was present at mine, but I don't remember it. I've never seen birth. I've never been around birth intentionally. I watched the movies where the ladies get strapped down and they're screaming, and I'm thinking, this is not for me. And some, my mom would always say, oh, that's not real. I guess they don't strap them down, but the screaming sometimes is still real. But as we were getting ready to have our baby, I'm getting fearful. And my older brother, they have 4 children, and he told me, hey man, he said, what you guys ought to do is you ought to take a birthing class. It's okay, I never heard of what's a birthing class. He said, this is what we did. For 16 weeks, we went to this birthing center, and they taught us all about it. And basically, he's like, I basically became a registered doula. I didn't actually become a doula, but I basically know everything to be a doula. We learned about this and this and this and this. And we were on the road, so we couldn't do a 16-week class. And so we're traveling, and my wife's getting more and more pregnant, and the due date is coming, and I'm getting more fearful. And finally, I'm back home, and we've got just a short window before the due date. And so we found a 4-hour express class. And so the 4-hour express class, the way it's designed, it was designed for people who've already had a baby and just need a refresher course. And there was 8 couples in this class, and none of us, we were all first-time parents. And for the first 2, and I'm not exaggerating this, the first 2 hours was spent on nutrition. Here's what you eat, here's what you do. I'm thinking, man, we're like 35 weeks along or whatever. We're past the point of the nutrition stuff. And the second 2 hours was learning how to work through contractions. So that's all I got in my 4-hour express class. So preparing for birth, I know that what she needs to eat and how to help her breathe, and that's it. Like transition, I've never heard of the word. I have no clue what that is all about. And there's a guy in my church, big guy, kickboxer, 6'4", 280 pounds, just a big guy. He's got like 7 kids. And I went to him and I said, man, Ryan, I'm scared about this. And he's like, oh man, birth's a miracle. It's a miracle. It's the most incredible thing. I was like, are you serious? He said, yeah, man, I was, oh, okay, maybe this isn't so bad. Until my wife went into labor. This is my first time experiencing anything like this. 24 hours of labor, excruciating. And I'm telling you, I did not experience the physical pain, but the emotional trauma for me watching my wife go through that was so, it was hard, it was so difficult. And I told my wife, we finished that, and I said, we are never doing that again. I think probably many young husbands have said that, and we now have a second, so apparently I reneged on that one. But we go into my wife goes into labor. We went to a birthing center in Milwaukee. We go to the birthing center. The midwives come in. They check on her, and they go out, and she labors and labors. And I'm not trying to be graphic, but what I'm doing this is for those of you who have not had children. I'm trying to create a picture so you could get a glimpse of what fatherhood is like. And I'm not being funny with that, but it was painful. My wife's gripping the side of the birthing tub there, going, when is this going to end? And internally, I'm agonizing inside, looking at the clock, going, surely by 3 o'clock we'll be over. 3 o'clock comes and goes, and 6 o'clock comes and goes, and 9 o'clock comes and goes, and she's labored in every position you can think of. And finally, at midnight, the midwives come in and they say, we got to move her around, do some things to try to help this thing along. And finally, at 2:30 in the morning, our firstborn comes out, and he came out. And I'm not trying to be too graphic, but I'm just saying it was difficult. My wife, with that last burst, they call it the ring of fire, that final painful push. And as Gilbert comes out, my wife, I am just so relieved that she finally is relieved from the pain. I could care less about that little boy. At least that's what I'm thinking. I'm going to care less about this little boy because I'm just so concerned. My wife is finally through this pain, and they lift that little guy up. I'm not a baby person. I've never been a baby person. If you put your baby in my arms, I'm going to be like, nice. I've never cared about babies. They've always been ugly to me. But when they picked that little boy up, first of all, I was amazed. My wife went immediately from immediate pain to just crooning over him. I couldn't believe it. It was unbelievable. And then they took him and they placed him in my arms. And every young father knows what this is like. They put that boy in my arms. I remember being overwhelmed by, this is mine. This isn't my dad's. This isn't my brother's. This isn't the government's. No one else can lay claim to this. This one's mine. And I remember just being overwhelmed with the miraculous, just the overwhelming ownership. This is my boy. If he's got my brother's nose, it came through me. Physically, biologically, the Lord brought my wife and I together, and from that, God created life. This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I care for no other kid, but this one's mine. The ownership of him being my boy totally moved me. I began to realize God is saying, you're mine. It's because you're my son that I love you. Look, Gilbert, he's 3. I get it. He's not a teenager yet. He's not made some of those mistakes that teenagers make, the way teenagers can break your heart. I understand that. But he's already at 3 years old done enough to embarrass me. And he's thrown temper tantrums. And he's hit his sister and disrespected his mother. He has done those things. But I'm telling you, church family, and especially with the young people who have not had yet children, I'm trying to help you understand this. My son can run away from home. He cannot even get saved. And I pray for that every day. I pray that he would get saved. But he could run away from home. He could shame the family name. He could choose to deny Jesus Christ, and I will never stop loving him. You say, wow, that's because you got a real, just a big pool of love. Nope. The reason is because he's mine. He's my boy. I remember reading a biography not long ago of a pastor whose oldest son, he had raised him, and he was real hard on him in the ministry. But the son had joined him in the ministry, and about 15 years into it, the son came to his father and said, Dad, we're done. My wife and I are moving west, and we don't want to ever hear from you. Do not contact us. We want nothing to do with you. And in that one meeting, the father never heard from his son for something like 25 years. The man just passed away last year, and to his deathbed, as best I know, he never heard from his son. In his biography, his granddaughter wrote it. It's Ed Nelson, if anybody knows that name, Ed Nelson. And Ed Nelson wrote from the biography, he said, my boy has been estranged for something like 25 years. But my heart breaks for him, and if he came back today, I would welcome him with open arms. My heart yearns for him. Why? Because he's my boy. See, there's something about the ownership of being a son that surpasses all love, and this is what Jesus is trying to help us understand. See, commandments, the understanding of commandments needs to flow out of realizing, man, I am loved, and so you are loved. So experience, abide, continue ye in my love. So God is telling us your status is love because you're my child. So I want you to know what it feels like. I want you to experience, I want you to live in it. I want you to abide in love. You say, how do I do that? Look at verse 10. if ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Now that verse does not mean that if you don't obey my commandments, you're no longer loved. That's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is, you are loved, but when you disobey my commandments, you don't experience it. You don't feel it. You're not living in the nearness of relationship, because when you obey my commandments, you get a hold of all of it. Let me try to illustrate it this way. How many of you have gone on family vacation with your whole family? Packed up the vehicle and headed on family vacation? Anybody? Okay, one family, two. Okay, all right, so several of you. Okay. When you go on family vacation, especially if you have kids in your vehicle, when you get back from family vacation, what's the vehicle look like? Okay, we're all agreeing it's usually trashed, is it not? Especially if it's of any length of time. I'm amazed, man. It's like we travel 4 hours, and I can't believe how quickly our vehicle, it proves evolution is wrong, because everything just keeps falling apart. But anyways, so you imagine with me, you go on family vacation, week long. Let's say you get back on a Friday night, and the next morning, Dad has to leave for the day. And so he says to you, you're his child, and he says, okay, son, daughter, I'd like you to clean the van. And then he leaves for the day. So the command is clear. So imagine with me, we got two scenarios. Dad leaves, and the first scenario is you forget to clean the van. So it's the evening time, Mom's making dinner, you're inside the house, and Dad comes home from his daily activities, remembering what he had told you. He walks up to the van, you've forgotten, and he walks up to the van, opens it up, and it's just as trashed as it was when you guys got back from your vacation. Now let me ask you, does your father love you? Yes. You're his child. If the house caught on fire right then, he would care nothing for the vehicle, and he would run in there and scoop you up and smother you, because you're his child, the abiding love is always there. Okay, so he loves you, but at this point, how's the relationship? It's hurt. So he walks inside the house, and when Dad opens the door, he loves you, but you've disobeyed him. And he walks inside the door, and you're at the other end of the house, and you see him walk through. Are you excited to see Dad? Oh, you remember, I disobeyed. Oh, this is not going to be good. Does Dad still love you? Yes, but the relationship has been hindered. There's distance between you because of disobedience, okay? So the father still loves, but the relationship is hurt. Now, second scenario. You remember to clean the van. Dad comes home, and maybe he's skeptical. He's not sure if you had followed through, but this time you did. And so he grabs that van door and opens it up, and wow, they did a great job, and they remembered, they obeyed. Dad still loves you because his son, and now the relationship is even closer. In fact, his pleasure is revealed. And when he walks in the door, are you excited to see him? Yeah, you might be going, hey, Dad, did you notice? Dad, did you see? Hey, Dad, did you remember to look in the van? Dad, I did it. In fact, you are longing to see him because of obedience. So what Jesus is trying to help us with is, look, guys, your love, the Father loves you, I love you. It flows from your sonship, so I want you to experience it. So obey my commandments. Because when you obey my commandment, I'm giving you that commandment so that we could be close. There's a story that is told of F.B. Meyer. Some of you maybe recognize that name. F.B. Meyer was a commentator and as well as a great pastor. F.B. Meyer was contemporary with a man by the name of C.T. Studd. C.T. Studd was a great missionary. God used him greatly in Africa. And for a time, both of these men lived at the same time in England. And F.B. Meyer tells a story of one morning he rose very, very early in the morning, so early that most normal people are asleep, and he had an engagement that he had to go to. And as F.B. Meyer was going to his engagement, it's still dark in the streets there in England, and he's walking along the street to go to his engagement, and he passes C.T. Studd's house. And there's a light on in the house. And it's so early that he would not have expected anybody's light to be on, because most normal people would be sleeping. And he sees the light on, and because of his friendship with C.T. Studd, he felt compelled, and he walks up to the door. At least this is how he tells the story. He walks up and he knocks on the door, and C.T. Studd comes to the door. And F.B. Meyer says, Brother Studd, I couldn't help but notice that your light was on, and I just have to ask you, why are you up this early in the morning? And C.T. Studd is recorded to have responded, well, the Bible says, if you love me, keep my commandments. So I've been searching the scriptures to see if I've missed any. Do you hear that heart? That's what C.T. Studd got a hold of, what Jesus got a hold of. Or I should say, C.T. Studd got a hold of what Jesus is teaching. And he's saying, look, my child, when I give you this book, this is not a list of do's and don'ts and restrictions to curb your lifestyle. That's not why I'm giving this to you. I'm giving you this as an extension of love. So I want you to pour yourself over this, be obedient to it, because your best life is not Friday. It's by being obedient. Yeah. And C.T. Studd got a hold of that, to the point where, at least by testimony, he's not looking to see what he has to do and can get away with. That's not what he's looking for. He's saying, Lord, I want all of you. Yeah. I want your heart. You communicate everything because I want to know you. Church family, look, think about the 10 Commandments. Do you think the 10 Commandments were given to a society to just make a society miserable? No, the 10 Commandments are the greatest gift of God for a society. They're an extension of His love. When actually, and if you love God and love man, you'll fulfill the 10 Commandments because it's all rooted in love. Would you want to live in a society where they didn't have the 10 Commandments? Move to California. Because what you're finding is that is a state where they are trying to really, in many ways, even by their own laws, remove any restriction of laws, and the state is turning into chaos. Because the greatest thing for a society is to be yielded to the commandments of God. But isn't it true that so often we look at God's commandments not like C.T. Studd, we actually look at God's commandments like, well, ignorance is bliss. If I don't know what's in there, I don't have to be held accountable. I was being at college a number of years ago. I remember hearing a guy, he started playing some music, and music that the college said while you're a student they weren't allowed to listen to. It didn't check, as it were. And one of the guys ran up to him and says, hey, don't you know that you're not? He said, stop. Don't tell me. If I don't know, I don't have to feel convicted. And we say, oh, wow, that's not a good attitude. But the truth is, most of us have done the exact same thing, myself included. We read the portions that we really like. I was preaching at a church up in Wisconsin. It was a large Christian school I was preaching at, and I got a lot of flack because I was dealing with some of the basic commandments, some of the things like flee fornication, was challenging the young people. Look, guys, if you're looking at pornography, if you're regularly looking at pornography and you're not dealing with it, the Proverbs tells you that you're a fool, and you need to get honest about your problem, and let's get honest with Jesus. And I was dealing with the issue of pornography, and I had several of the staff members come to me. We sat down in a meeting, and they said, Nick, look, man, you're preaching on pornography too much. Look, we need to just show love to these kids. And I told my wife, I did not feel freedom in that meeting to say this, but I told my wife later, I said, look, at this church, they want me to say, where are thine accusers? But they don't want to hear, go and sin no more. And so often in our movement today, and I am all for this, but in our movement today, we have so glorified, now don't misunderstand me, we have so glorified the goodness and forgiveness of God, which is necessary. So please don't misunderstand me. But what we've missed out on is His commandments. And we've said we don't have to obey Him because He will forgive us. And Paul deals with that and he says, should I continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. You actually, if all you know is the forgiveness of God, but you never know the commandments of God, you will never know a relationship with God. Amen. And so that's why Jesus is trying to help us see, look, my child, I want you to know my commandments so that we would be close. Do you know the person who is the most miserable in this world? It's the rebel. The rebel will not yield to anyone or anything. And he is the most miserable because he has no close friends. He has no authorities that can speak into his life. He has no one near to him because he will never submit and be obedient to anything or anybody. And the truth is, we often find ourselves in that same place. So could I ask you, is ignorance of God's commandments truly bliss? We were traveling, this would have been 2019, so my wife was still pregnant with Gilbert. We hadn't had him yet. She was about 7 months pregnant. We were at a Christian school in Michigan, and I was traveling with the Minutemen ministry at that time. We were doing like a 6-week stint with them. So if you're familiar with that ministry, Jim Van Gelderen is typically the one that leads it. They'll do teen sports competitions, and so I was one of the team captains, and we would preach to the Christian school kids during the day, and in the evening we'd hold a rally and a gospel rally. And so we got to the school early one morning, and my wife, I think it was a Thursday, my wife said to me, we rolled in, it's like 7:30 in the morning, she's 7 months pregnant, and she says to me, I'm already not feeling well. Please, as soon as the day is over, as soon as we are able, can we go home? Because I'll get through the day, but I just feel very, very uncomfortable. And any lady who's been pregnant, you understand, you identify with that. But me, young husband, not identifying with that, yes ma'am, in one ear and really out the other, because I'm focused on ministering to the kids, right? And so we go into the daytime, and we're with the kids, and we get into the evening rally. And during the evening rally, during one of the sports competitions, I'm one of the team captains. One of the guys did something that I felt was unsportsmanlike and unethical, and it made me mad. And so I'm in the flesh, I lose my cool, and I hit him with that big ball as hard as I could, because I was just trying to get my point across, and it knocked him off his feet. He was a big boy. He hit the ground and bounced. It kind of made me feel good a little bit, because I was just trying to get my point across. The other team captain realizes that we're getting into it, and now he's frustrated that we're frustrated. And so we kind of have this row together, and finally Jim Van Gelderen over the microphone, he's got a code word for the guys, and he says, okay, he uses his code word, which basically means cool it, guys. And so we kind of back off, and I realize, man, I lost my cool. This is not good. And so the games end. We go into the evening gospel time. The gospel's preached. Some kids get saved. And so after it's all over, the kids go home. We have a team debrief. And so Dr. Jim brings in the entire team, my wife, the girls, us guys. And okay, how'd that go? How'd that go? Okay, good. All right, ladies, he says, you're dismissed. Guys, I need to talk to you. And we know where this is going. We'd made a big blunder on the field, and we're going to be dealt with. And so the girls are sent out. My wife is sent out. They're all gone. And he says, guys, what happened out there? And Dr. Jim, it was me. I was wrong here. And the other guy says, I was wrong. And so we work it all out, and we're working it through. And we ask each other to forgive each other, and we get it taken care of. Conversation's over. Everything's good. And we're sitting there. And then someone brings up politics, which is an easy conversation for anybody. And so we jump into a conversation of politics. Really, we're just chewing the cud at this point, shooting the breeze, just talking about politics and really wasting time talking about politics. And then finally, Dr. Jim says, okay, guys, I got to head to my trailer, make sure everything's cleaned up. I'll see you in the morning. So then he leaves. We get all the equipment cleaned up. And I stepped out of the room that we were meeting in. I looked down the hallway. And I'm thinking in my mind, I wonder where my wife is. I wonder where Emma is. I look down the hallways, and I don't see her. And my conclusion was, well, I'm sure she's doing whatever girls do at this time of night. I've never been a girl, so I don't know what girls do at this time of night. So I'm sure when she's ready, she'll let me know. And so I make my way to the kitchen and start eating cold pizza that we had from that night. And I'm sitting there eating, and the other two guys come in. They're sitting there eating, and we're just shooting the breeze, talking. And I'm just waiting for my wife to let me know when she's ready. I'm a willing, yielded husband. Honey, you just tell me when you're ready, and I'll obey. She had already told me, and I had neglected it. Finally, it dawns on me I should check my phone, and I pull out my cell phone, and there's a text on the screen from 45 minutes previous that says, I'm in the van, please hurry. And immediately, I'm embarrassed because she's probably sitting there waiting for me. I'm assuming that she's fuming, so I'm getting mad now internally. And so, guys, I got to go. And I run out to the van, and I'm trying to think of a way I can defend myself, diffuse this situation, put the blame back on her because I'm feeling embarrassed. And I grab the side door, and I open it up, and I say, why didn't you tell me you were out here? And she says, I thought I told you this morning that as soon as the night was over, I needed to go. And immediately I remember her words. And I will tell you, my ignorance, my neglect, was no longer bliss. I was brought to a reckoning on her previous commandments. And I would have gone back and taken back all the cold pizza and the conversation about politics and all of that wasted time that I enjoyed during the time. But when I was brought to a place of accountability, I realized I hurt her because of my neglect. Church family, there's coming a day. I'm just telling you, there's coming a day when every single one of us are going to stand before the Lord. And we will not be able to say, but I didn't know. Because He's going to say, but my son, I gave it to you. I gave you the living word. It was full of my love. It was full of my relationship. My child, I had so much for you. Why did you neglect it? And I'm telling you, church family, when the day of reckoning comes, it will not be bliss. Every man who has ever laid on his deathbed thinks back to the years he wasted. The money that maybe he hoarded that he wishes he hadn't. Just this last week, my grandfather got a cancer diagnosis, and they've told him, you've got a year. And in the last several days, he told me, he said, I'm doing a lot of soul searching. It's amazing the things that you find are so passionate to live for, but then when you realize that your day is finally coming, there's actually an expiration date. There's a time coming where you're going to see the Lord. You start reanalyzing all your decisions, and you start to wonder, was it worth it? Church family, I'm pleading with you as God has done with me. Caleb, you cannot afford to neglect my commandments, but Caleb, you don't want to. Because I have so much good for you. I have so many rich blessings. I have people that I want you to lead to Christ and to disciple so that they would go on and impact other people. And I have them for you, but you're spending all your time on YouTube and you will not yield to my Spirit. And when we go out to Whataburger and you resist my Spirit, that's your MO, and I had a person there waiting for you. Church family, we cannot plead ignorance when we regularly disobey His commandments, His Spirit's prompting to us, and then wonder why we're not living in a rich relationship with Him. Now let me ask you, if we all find ourselves thinking, man, I too often think, man, run away from God's commandments, is that just because we are carnal, just bad people? Is that why? Certainly, every single one of us have a fallen nature. But is there something more? And this is where I will finish tonight. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 3. This is the last spot we're going to be, and I will not take long. The truth is that for all of us, we want to be submitted to Jesus as long as it's in areas that we like. So when Jesus begins to deal with us about our entertainment, and Jesus begins to deal with us about our friend choices, and Jesus begins to deal with us with our social media accounts, when Jesus begins to deal with us about our hobbies on the side that are not inherently evil, that you can plead your Christian liberty over, but the truth is you're not submitted to the Spirit of God's voice. In all of those areas, when Jesus begins to speak to us, naturally we find ourselves saying, I don't want to give up something. Because naturally, our view of God's Spirit impressing upon us to be obedient, we find that to be something where I lose. Because I obey, I miss out. And I believe there's a reason why we think that way. And the reason is because we've all believed a lie that Eve believed all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. And we need to identify the lie. Because moving forward, you will not be able to keep the aura of this service tonight. But if you can remember the truth that counteracts this lie, the next time the Spirit says, turn that radio off, you can remember this truth. The next time the Spirit comes to you and says you need to get rid of that in your wardrobe. The next time the Spirit says you need to put your phone down and go talk to this person. The next time the Spirit says, I want you to take your checkbook out and I want you to give to that hurting family. We need to remember this truth. In Genesis chapter 2, if you remember Genesis 1 and 2, God's creation of the world, God's creation of mankind. When Adam and Eve are created, how does the Bible describe their relationship with God? Is it good or is it bad? You tell me. Like incredible, isn't it? The best relationship any mortal man has had with God in heaven. They walked in perfection with Him. The relationship where He came down every night in the cool of the day and He walked and talked with them. I mean, it was incredible, better than we've ever experienced. And if we could go back to that garden, all of us would long and live for that. We wouldn't want to leave. Genesis chapter 3, we're introduced to the devil in the form of a serpent, with a lie that has affected humanity ever since. He comes to Eve and says, and the serpent, well, let me read Genesis 3:1. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Now listen to that phrase. The serpent says to Eve, did God say you're not allowed to eat of any of these trees? Now, is that what God said? No, it's not what God said. In fact, God said to them, hey guys, guess what? You can have them all but one. Now, does that sound restrictive to you? Does that sound like God is a really mean taskmaster? Like that's a bummer serving Jesus. Think about this. If Pastor tonight, and he wouldn't do this because I don't think his wife would let him, but imagine with me if Pastor set up 3 8-foot tables here and filled them with dozens of Krispy Kreme donuts. And as you came in, he said, okay, folks, I want you guys all to take as many donuts tonight as you want. I mean, I've got more in the back room, so this is just the tip of the iceberg. Have as many donuts as you want. Eat to your heart's content. I've just got one Boston cream over here. That's for my wife. Please, no one touch that one, but the rest is yours. Would anybody here be like, oh, Pastor, come on. You're so restrictive. You're holding out on us. You won't let us have the one single donut. No one would think that, would we? We'd be like, who cares about Boston cream? I don't even like Boston. I mean, look at this. I can have 2,400 donuts and I can diabetes, you know? And this is what God did to Adam and Eve. He came to them and said, you see the whole garden? The whole thing, it's all yours. All of it, but one. That sounds lavish to me. But the serpent comes and says, hey, did God say you couldn't eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden? He's already trying to impress upon her thinking that God's holding out on her. And she says, no. We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Now that is true. God said, you can't eat of it, because if you eat of the fruit, you will die. And this is what the serpent says. Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes will be opened. Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Now, if you're like me, when I read verse 5, I find myself thinking, does he know something we don't know? Like even the way he phrases it, it sounds appealing, does it not? You're going to be as gods. Your eyes are going to be open. You'll know good and evil. It kind of sounds like, wow, maybe the devil knows something we don't know. Maybe God really has a better life and I can't afford to be obedient to him. That's exactly what the devil wants us to think. His conclusion, his lie is, follow Jesus and you will find that you're restricted. His commandments, man, they curb your style. And so what does Eve do? She takes a bite of the fruit. She gives to Adam. Adam also disobeys the commandments of God, takes a bite of the fruit, and what happens? Actually, everything in verse 5. Their eyes were opened. They became as gods, knowing good and evil. God says it in verse 7 and verse 22. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? In fact, what the devil tempted them with of, you're missing out. They were missing out. And when they disobeyed the commandment of God, they found that their relationship was deeply impacted. Their spirit went dead. Their relationship was hurt. And their eyes were opened. They became as gods, knowing good and evil. This is what the serpent does to teenagers. He comes to the teenagers and says, you've never slept around? Whoa. You're missing out. That's what our television says. That's what our country songs say. That's what our hip-hop artists say. Whoa, you've never tried the free love? You're missing out. And anybody who has ever lived in that lifestyle will tell them they are missing. They're missing shame. They're missing remorse. They're missing regret. They're missing mistakes. Man, I want to miss out on that kind of lifestyle. But if you believe the lie that God can't be trusted, the devil's temptation seems believable. He comes to us as husbands and say, you haven't watched the game yet? You haven't seen all the highlight reel? Hey man, look, there's another YouTube short. You ought to watch it a little bit longer. Whoa, you haven't seen that girl on the pornography page in a while? It's been a long time. You know your soul needs it. You're missing out. He comes to the ladies and he says, you haven't found out what all your girlfriends are doing on Facebook? Whatever temptation he gives the ladies, I'm not a lady, so I struggle with that one, the application. I'll let you decide what that is. But the truth is, every time we obey the devil's lie, we miss out on love, joy, and friendship. If the devil's logic were true, and I'm done. If the devil's logic were true, here's his logic. Resist God's commandments and experience life. If his logic were true, the one we all have found ourselves believing. We've all fallen into this trap of resisting God's commandments, running from the prompting of the Spirit. If that was true, that you resist God and experience life, wouldn't we see it played out somewhere? You will never find it anywhere. Have you ever resisted God's Spirit's, His prompting? Have you ever resisted the commandments of the Scripture and got excited about it? The truth is, every time we resist the Spirit of God, embrace the lie of the devil, you get off the computer after watching an hour of pornography and you're kicking yourself. It's not love, joy, and friendship. It's remorse and regret. Every time you hold on to that cash and say, no, Lord, I can't afford to give it to that person. I just can't. And then the next week your transmission blows and you're going, man, I should have just given it away. You will never find it anywhere. The logic of the devil. I mentioned it this morning from Psalm 16 verse 4. But the truth is, every Hollywood artist, every actor is pursuing this lie. Look, every music artist today that is in the popular scene singing secular music is pursuing this lie. Resist God. Experience life. They'll all tell you it's not working out. In Papua New Guinea, and I use this just because it's maybe one of the last countries where there still is unreached tribes. In Papua New Guinea for many years, that nation did not know who God was. They didn't know the Bible. They had not heard the name Jesus Christ. If you've read Don Richardson's Peace Child about the early 50s when missionaries began to enter into the interior of Papua New Guinea, they found a culture who didn't know God. They found a culture who was living for resist the things of God and experience torment. Every culture who doesn't know God, their people go to their deathbeds screaming in fear of the spiritual world. Killing the pigs and putting the pigs' grease on their face, trying to appease an unknown deity. They don't have love, joy, and friendship. And so what God is telling us is, my child, I am unlike any other God. When I give my commandments, it's for your good. It's to experience love, joy, and friendship. So would we tonight start this revival meeting by saying, Lord, I want to put this to the test. If that's really what your commandments are, you prompt me, I will obey because I want to see if it's real. The very first time I ever heard this passage exegeted, I was struggling a lot with a habitual sin. Sexual in nature. I heard this passage exegeted and I said, Lord, if it's true, I'm going to test you. I went home to my dorm room that day. I walked into the dorm knowing I was going to be tempted in this area. I said, Lord, I'm going to resist because I want to know if you're right. I remember that day walking out of my dorm to go to the cafeteria for dinner. Still freedom in my soul. I hadn't succumbed to the temptation. I didn't have to make a phone call to my dad saying, Dad, I fell again. I didn't have anything more to tell my fiance or whatever saying, hey, I failed again. I didn't have that. I walked to the dormitory in freedom and liberty, still walking with Jesus. I could have had a prayer meeting or with joy went and played a basketball game. I wasn't down in the dumps. I remember walking back to the cafeteria going, man, I put it to the test and it's true. It's better. Amen. Last year when I need to be done. Last year, the Lord prompted us, I want you to give. We received a huge love offering from a church. I came home excited, one of the biggest love offerings I've ever received. And the Lord says, you see that evangelist that's parked next to you, whose truck is falling apart? Give him your love offering. Lord, the whole thing? I said, yes, give it to him. And as I reckoned with the Lord, God began to deal with me. Caleb, obedience, is it better? We wrote out that check, not out of constraint. Wrote out that check for that love offering, walked up and knocked on his trailer door and says, brother, this is from the Lord. And as I gave it to him, man, giving is better than receiving. Yeah, and I found it again to be true. Would you put it to the test? When God says, delete that, give that, turn that off, go here, don't go there. Cut off that friendship, start that relationship. Would we put it to him to the test? this week and find, is it true? Because when we obey, it's an invitation. Love, joy, and friendship.